Okay, welcome back to Introductory Sociology. How was that survey you did on Tuesday? What was that all about? What? Dumb?
Yeah.
Like what was an example question they asked you?
If you met with an advisor, how many times have you met with an advisor?
Okay, stuff like that. Took you about a half hour or more?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so today we're going to be talking about race and ethnicity, but before we do that, I wanted to point out I've made a few changes to the web page, or that is the Canvas site. So now if you click on Pages, there's a link that says Pages, and then within that there's a place here that says, you can't see it, but it says Class Lecture Videos. It's kind of small. But when you click on that, what I've done now is I've organized them all in chronological order. So for example, Class 1 Introduction, you could click there, and Class 2, the perspectives and so forth. And so right now is it race and ethnicity, but I'm up to date now, and it's all there. Now, of course, I can't do the movies because that would definitely get me a YouTube, a copyright violation, so I'm not going to try to post the movies. They're films and can be rented at most anywhere. Okay, so we're going to talk about race and ethnicity today. And first off, just as an initial comment about how things have changed, if you want to do a little bit of interesting research, go Google the University of Washington Ku Klux Klan archive. You don't really, when you think about the Klan, you don't think about the West Coast so much, but in the 20s and 30s, it was so mainstream that it was not uncommon for a Klans member to preach at the Sunday night service at a local Baptist church, for there to be Klan weddings and marches, and now, this is an old photo of a neo-Nazi, but basically when you get somebody that's overtly racist in society today, he's ridiculed, made fun of. It's so, not to say we don't have racism, but it's not as tolerated, it's not as acceptable as it once was. Another website is Without Sanctuary, an online exhibit of lynchings. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, lynchings were basically where white people got upset, typically at a minority, and decided just to go hang that person without a trial. Now, what's shocking, though, is these lynchings were so public in some cases that little kids would come out, for 7 o'clock, and they'd put the blanket on the ground, they'd have potato salad, and they'd take pictures and send it to their friends. And so it was, when you think of lynching, you think of it as something done very secretively behind, out in the forest somewhere. But a lot of this was so mainstream that it was sort of a community event. So we've come a long way since that time. Now, let's talk about a minority. First off, it doesn't mean a numerical minority. Now hate to do this, I just want to make sure I'm good, because I don't want to have to redo this. I've done that twice. So, a minority. It usually is a numerical minority, but not always. It's a group within a society that is discriminated against. And so women are considered a minority. And the blacks in South Africa, although there are more than whites, are considered to be a minority. So because of their physical or cultural characteristics, they're singled out and treated differently and receive unequal treatment. And so what is a minority can change over time. So the various white ethnic groups, if you went back 80 or 100 years ago, there used to be a level of discrimination against Italian Americans or Swedish Americans, but that's no longer the case. So at one point, they were a minority group, and now they're not. I remember my grandmother, Esther, she's deceased now, but she was born in Sweden. And I remember once she was talking to her mechanic, Mr. Vaskulen, and they had both been told by the Dutch that if you're not Dutch, you're not much, and if you're black, stay back. that was so I remember Mr. Vaskulen and my grandmother, they said, yeah, it's really uncomfortable, the Dutch are hating on us. They use different words, but we don't think of that anymore. It's uncommon. That is, I don't think of myself as a Swedish person. It really doesn't give me much, I don't give much attention to that. But if there were a higher level of discrimination, then I'd identify as being of that origin. So, some keys to this definition. The minorities tend to have a distinctive physical or cultural trait which makes them identifiable. Early on in America, the first people who functioned as slaves, well, I put that in quotation marks, they were indentured servants. Basically, back then, in Old England, if you got into debt, you couldn't just declare bankruptcy, you had to work it off. And so, more or less, you functioned as a slave. Now, early on in American history, though, the problem with white people working as slaves was if they ran away, it was harder to identify them. And two, you couldn't really pick and choose. So you could get unhealthy people getting into debt. Whereas with the slave trade, you could pick the healthier, stronger people, and they were, of course, in American history, at one point they were all slaves, and so it was easier to identify them. Now, minority status is reflected in a society's stratification structure, which can be overt in the rules and laws. Prior to 1964, we had this separate but equal doctrine, and it really was never equal. So they would have a white drinking fountain and one for colored people. They'd have separate places in the bus or in the theater. And that was written into the law. Or there may be laws that make it difficult for minorities to succeed. And then there's just the general social reaction that is, for example, a person who is racist may not want to hire a minority, or they may pay them less. There was in my old race and ethnic textbook, there was a photo from the 20s, and it was advertising for people to unload boats. I think longshoremen, and it had this pay scale, and it was something like this. It was like whites, they got like $1 an hour, and then the Italians got 75 cents, and the Irish, and so, of course, the African Americans were paid the least. But the point is, these various white ethnic groups at that time were not considered truly white. I mean, early on, the only way you could be white is if you were of English origin in America. Now, the traits of the minorities are judged by the majority to be inferior, and often used to justify unequal treatment or ridicule. So sometimes it could be a food preference. Like you could, I'm not saying you should, but historically some people would make fun of, say, Asians because if they're eating rice, or make fun. How would Mexicans be made fun of? Beans, eating too many. And then also just the physical characteristics could be used by the majority. Now, I'll say, so to justify unequal treatment. Now, we'll talk later on about valid and invalid discrimination, but there are certain scenarios where treating somebody differently or giving someone more of a preference based on race would be justifiable. Very few. For example, if the FBI was trying to find an agent to infiltrate the Ku Klux Klan, would it be legitimate to not consider any African American agents? Why? Yes, and why? Because they won't have they won't be able to get into the Klan because they don't accept it, obviously. So, of course, that's a silly example, but the point is there are some scenarios where it would be acceptable. So, because minorities know they're suffering discrimination, they have a common sense of identity that they wouldn't otherwise have. So, well, like people here who would you consider yourself Caucasian or white, do you know if you went back far enough, where's your ancestry? Like, where did your great-great-great-grandparents come from? Ireland?
I think my dad's side is English, but my mom's side is Ecuadorian.
Ecuadorian,
So, yeah.
okay. Yeah, so, but the point is, you don't wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and say, there's a fine-looking Irish lady. I mean, it doesn't give you, how much thought do you give to being Irish? Not much. Doesn't. And so, but the point is, going back historically, when there was a level of discrimination against the Irish, there was more of a sense of identity. So the idea here, when we start treating people equally and there's not that discrimination, it's being African American, being Hispanic, being Asian will be less of an issue. It's not, you're not going to wake up every morning and have that the thought that you're not going to think about your ancestry. So membership in a minority group is ascribed. People didn't choose it, they became a member by their birth. Now, race, the significance of race is it's a group of people who are alleged to share certain biologically inherited characteristics, but in reality, this strict dichotomy where we want to put everybody into a specific box doesn't work. I mean, have you ever been asked to check a box for your race and forms and so on? The idea, though, is that race exists more along a continuum. Just like when kids draw a rainbow, it has very distinct colors. So the blue, and then you get to the whatever other colors there are. But in reality, it sort of blends together. And so people that we consider Asian or African American, they don't all look the same. They don't all exhibit the same, but we want to categorize. In fact, if people are sort of ambiguous, sometimes kids are confused or want to question that. Like I remember my son Kosei, of course my wife is Japanese, but around 8th grade he was going to a soccer practice and there were a group of kids talking and they said, "What's up with Kosei? Is he Chinese or what?" And then someone says, "No, he was born in Albany." And they say, "Oh, okay, that figures." And what does this mean? But the idea here is that, I'm not sure there's anyone here who is racially ambiguous, but there are people that you couldn't necessarily throw a label on them. So race is a social creation. That is how we categorize and how we label it. And it's arbitrary and it's not all the same throughout the world. The reality is that, say, blacks and whites are of course, genetically similar. The point is, it's not a variable with mutually exclusive categories. We can properly classify race as running along a continuum or mosaic. Each person varies in terms of exhibiting certain racial categories or characteristics. So you'll see that people who we label white don't necessarily look all the same. And that's true of any race. Like we consider Polynesians to be Asian, but I mean, if you Google it, they don't look necessarily the same as Koreans or Japanese or Chinese, but we lump them all together. So Swedish versus Italian origin, the point I'm making here is there was a point in our history where if you were Italian, you weren't considered white. And actually in World War I, by default, they would assign Italian Americans to lower level MOS in the military because they were thought to be genetically stupid. They weren't as intelligent as the white people. And so that was the thinking. Now, so the idea here, we can't objectively classify all people into the racial categories that we have. It's not an either-or characteristic. And so this this computer-generated image shows you how somebody could be maybe 40-50 and 60-40, etc. Although in our society, unless you're completely white, you're considered to be of African American origin. Or sometimes, it's just, I mean, I knew a few of my friends, my son's friends who played soccer, and what was it? Oreo, they called him Oreo because he was racially ambiguous. But his father was black, and his mother was Hispanic, but he primarily looked Hispanic, and so people, if they had to guess, they'd say, "Oh, he's of Hispanic origin." So race then is difficult to measure. Barack Obama was the son of a black, or is the son of a black Kenyan and a white American from Wichita, Kansas. And so there's some debate or discussion, for example, on the back pages of Wikipedia, about how he should be labeled. One writer said Obama's own identification of his ethnicity should be all that matters. But the point is, there's Barack Obama as a baby with his biological birth mother. And yet, we primarily, the media, everyone refers to him as the first black president, when it would be better, or not better, but biracial, or, I mean, how do you think Obama should be labeled racially? Black or white, or both? I mean, but the point is, in our society, he's considered to be African American. Tiger Woods is an interesting case. This is an older photo. As you can see, his father is of Polynesian origin. His mother is Korean. He has I don't think he has any African American ancestry in his genes, but because he appears to be black, he is labeled black. And early on, he used to fight that. The media, the news reports refer to him as a black golfer, and he said, I'm Asian, but why can't he be Asian? Why is it that society and the news media, for example, has always called him black? Why would you think? Although his mother is Korean and his father is primarily Polynesian. Yeah, they just go by your looks. And so I used to teach in the Japanese Agricultural Exchange Program. It's a program where the farming students from Japan come over and they learn English and some farming skills and so forth. But I remember and then they get placed on a farm. And I remember a couple of they called them trainees. A couple of them, when they were working in California, they got dark tans. And then people kept thinking that they were Hispanic and speaking to them in Spanish, and they had to show their passport. It's nothing to argue about, but people just couldn't believe that they were Japanese. So that shows you how appearance matters. So the idea then is that we could just as easily classify all people with brown eyes or tall people into fitting into a particular racial group. So what is defined as a racial group is a matter of opinion. Irish and Italians are no longer considered a distinct racial group. And of course, it comes down to appearance. Hitler considered the Jews a racial group and made them wear identifying marks like the Star of David. Why do you think he forced them to wear things?
There wasn't that much distinction between the German.
Right, because they didn't necessarily look any different than the Germans, and so the point is that that was one of his problems. How do you discriminate against a group if they're not easily identifiable? Now, what about ears? This is a genetic difference. I have sort of a dangling ear, but some people have it that is more like B's. Anyone like B? No. Or feet. Typically, the average is the top one, but there are people that are in the middle. Is anyone here more flat, or anyone with a very high arch? Yeah. But the point is that these are based in genes, just like skin color is. So genetically, as your book says, two tall men have more in common with each other than men of the same race. So if aliens hypothetically came to the Earth and kidnapped these basketball players and performed like the alien autopsy, they would probably consider them to be of the same race because they don't have the idea that color determines race. Now, some societies have defined race based on height. A little history here in Rwanda, the Belgian colonist created races based on tribal identity. In Rwanda, they had various tribes, and the Tutsis tended to be a bit more tall and slender, and the Hutu were more short and stocky, and they put one group in power so that they could more effectively control the country. And because in reality it's difficult to tell the difference between a Hutu and a Tutsi, they issued them identity cards so that, like on their driver's license, it would identify their race. And of course, this led to, has anyone seen the film Hotel Rwanda? You have. It's about the genocide there. It got to the point where one group wanted to kill the others, but when in reality they look very similar, as depicted in this short clip.
So, what is the actual difference between a Hutu and a Tutsi?
According to the Belgian colonists, the Tutsis are taller, more elegant. It was the Belgians that created the division. They picked people, those with thinner noses, lighter skin. They used to measure the width of people's noses. The Belgians used the Tutsis to run the country. Then when they left the power to the Hutus. And of course, the Hutus took revenge on the elite Tutsis for years of repression. Am I telling the truth, Paul?
Yes, unfortunately. Please take this to the general. Benedict is our finest journalist in Kigali, an expert on the subject.
So what are you, Paul?
I am Hutu. Gentlemen. More champagne?
ask you a personal question? Are you a Hutu or a Tutsi?
I am Tutsi.
And your friend, Tutsi?
No, I'm Hutu.
They could be twins. Get the camera. The general's going to give us an interview.
So the point then is that the society created the race. The Belgian colonists did. But once it gets going, it's hard to stop. Because if you watch the film, a lot of people didn't agree with this. But if you've got Hutus running around with machetes and killing the Tutsis for the years of repression, you get locked into this racial animosity. The Japanese created a racial group amongst themselves called the Burakumin. Now, Japan is a racially homogenous society. They've never actually had any significant minority group. But going back historically, what happened was in traditional Buddhism, there's sort of a hang-up with dealing with death in two areas. One is morticianers, like people who deal with the dead bodies, funeral directors and so forth. And then second would be those who slaughter animals. Now, of course, the Japanese love to eat meat, and if you love to eat meat, somebody's going to have to kill the cow or whatever. And so the Burakumin historically were arbitrarily picked and labeled as Burakumin, and they primarily worked in those two areas, morticians and slaughtering animals, and they were discriminated against, and so and on their identity cards, their birth records and so forth, they were labeled as Burakumin, and so prior to 1964, 65 or so, you could actually research in the public registry to find out. And so, like, if you were a father and your daughter was going to get married, one of the things that just by default they would do is make sure that there's no history of Burakumin ancestry. Or if you're going to hire somebody for a job, what they would do is they'd make sure that they'd screen out all the Burakumin. So the Burakumin tended to be poor on welfare. And when I was in Japan in 1992, I asked some of the Japanese what they thought about the Burakumin, and they said, well, they don't smell that good. They're lazy. All they want to do is be on welfare and so forth. And in reality, here's a modern example. Here's some Burakumin in more up-to-date photo. They don't look all that different from the Japanese, and they are. But the Japanese created this group because they needed a group, I think, or they thought they needed a group to discriminate against. And so in fact, they passed civil rights legislation in the 60s to protect the Burakumin, but there's still a lot of hatred of this group. So the point is, societies can create a minority group where one previously didn't exist. Like in Rwanda, you had the tribal differences, but they weren't really racial differences until the Belgian colonists enforced it that way. Now, historically, Americans have followed this one-drop rule that if you look a little bit of African American, then you're black. Colin Powell, for example, is biracial, but the former Secretary of State, but he's considered black. But if you were to ask Brazilians, they would consider him to be white because they have a different way of looking at it. So the point is then that our how we define race is arbitrary. Now, ethnicity, this is a group identified by its unique cultural characteristics or country of origin. Ethnic minorities can be subcultures. They have their own ways of life, language, religion, values, and beliefs, but they tend to be assimilated. And we'll talk more about that as we proceed. So, assimilation. Malcolm X once said the only thing he liked assimilated was his coffee and cream. He was credited because assimilation is where the minority group over time fuses together with the majority so that they give up their old ways and traditions and they become like the majority. I'll give you an example. My grandmother, Esther, when she came to the U.S., her name was Astrid Sundberger. And she had a friend named Berger Solberger. Berg means mountains. So that in Sweden there's mountains, and so a lot of times you get that. She changed her name, and because she was probably about 11 years old when she came over, she quickly learned English. And she went away to the University of Washington, got a nursing degree, and then got married to a guy who wasn't Swedish, and so then had my father, and he had a couple siblings. But over time, and at least initially, they all hung out with Swedish people, and that they had a strong sense of their nationality, their origins. But over time, they just blended in together with the majority, and they assumed the ways of the majority. Now, this can be, assimilation can be negative. I mean, I knew a guy who was a refugee from, it was Rwanda, it was in Grand Rapids. But anyway, I remember when we first met him, he had tall black guy, he had beautiful teeth. And he'd never seen a dentist. And then he assimilated to the American diet and drank a lot of Mountain Dew. Guess what happened? He became friends with the dentist. And so, I mean, we can think about this. Is there anything in our way of life that's not necessarily desirable? Like in Japan, people walk a lot. I mean, not to say they don't drive, but they find it odd that in America, somebody might get in a car and drive a half a mile to go shopping. You know, you would just walk or ride a bike or something. But in America, we're used to this. We don't give it much thought. I mean, think about this. Is there anything in our way of life as Americans that isn't desirable? I mean, our culture, our way of life. Anyone seen the movie Super Size Me?
I've heard of
Yeah,
it.
it's about basically about a fast food. I mean, we eat a lot of packaged foods and so forth. But the point is, though, that it's sort of inevitable. It's difficult because, like, if you're in America and say your parents are from Korea and they want you to retain the language and learn about the culture, kids don't really care that much. And they, you know, like, I have a friend, a Hispanic friend, and one of the things, his hangs up is, like, his kids are speaking a language, I don't know what he called it, but what's it called when you mix English up with Spanish? Spanglish? Yeah. And so, and then they weren't speaking in good grammar, and so he went, and I remember he was telling his daughters, he said, why won't you just, you know, learn proper good Spanish? And they just didn't care. I mean, it's sort of if you're a kid and you're being raised in whatever culture, you assimilate that and pick it up by naturally. So assimilation is one thing, and it doesn't happen immediately. It happens over time. Now, a second reaction is the melting pot. Here you have minorities that blend together with the majority, but they don't completely give up their old ways of life, and they impact the majority to some extent. Like if you have a pot of stew, and you add some seasoning to it, it changes the flavor and texture a little bit. And so, for example, when I first came here to Clovis, New Mexico, I saw on the side of the road they were cooking green chilies in these rotational, I don't know what do you call those machines they cook them in? It's like it's got a flame, a bunch, and they spin it around, and yeah, a green chili roaster. Yeah, and I'm thinking, what is this? Like, what are, and people are buying it, and so, but the point is that because we have a high percent of Hispanics in Clovis, then I remember talking to, like, I was Jim, a guy retired from the fire department. You know, you talk to people who are Caucasian in Clovis, and they all know about green chili and probably eat it. Whereas when I came from Washington, it was a new thing. So the minority can impact or affect the majority to some extent. Now, another reaction is the tossed salad, where traditions and cultures exist side by side. That's less common unless you have a very large, like in Canada, they have a large French-Canadian population. Now, cultural pluralism, in this case, you get many ethnic enclaves like Dutch or Swedish towns. This is Linden, Washington. It was about 8 miles from where I grew up in Ferndale. But Linden is changing. But back in the 70s, I would say definitely, probably 60 or 70% of the population spoke Dutch as their primary language. There was no no cigarette or alcohol sales on Sunday. Of course, we have that here. But it was Calvinist. I mean, the religion was primarily Reformed, Christian reforms, and so this is less common today. But in our history, we did have. Has anyone ever been to a German town or heard of them? They're less common, but you had these towns that were primarily of one ethnic origin. So cultural pluralism. Now, finally, accommodation. Here the minority totally maintains its way of life. The Cubans in Miami are an example. I haven't been to Miami. I've been to other cities in Florida. Anyone ever been to Miami? No. But I understand that if you go to the Little Havana section, there are places where it's pretty much, they speak Spanish. It's totally a Cuban way of life. And I think probably in Quebec with the French Canadians, you get that going as well. So accommodations. Now, conflict, genocide, or ethnic cleansing is the extreme form of conflict. And you normally think of this as homicide, of killing off the group you don't like, but there's another form. It's genocide by attrition. There's a film called A White Rabbit Fence. A little background here. In Australia, they introduced jackrabbits at one point and didn't have enough natural predators to keep, so it got out of control, and they're trying to, it was an ongoing struggle, so they put a fence through the country basically and tried to keep the rabbits on one side of it. But anyway, so it's sort of a guideline. People could follow that to get from the fence. But anyway, what they would do with the Aboriginal population that lived in poverty is they would go in and then they would have the men get vasectomies, for their own good, and then they would take away the children as because there was poverty and higher rates of disease, and so they take away the kids and have them adopted by white families. And so two little girls actually, they ran away, and that's the film depicts them trying to get back to where they were at. But what happened is over time, if you sterilize and perform vasectomies on the men and take their kids away, what happens to that population over time? It starts to decrease. It dies. And that's what you saw. If you look at it, is over time the Australians pretty much got rid of the Aboriginal population, and this policy went up until I think 1962. But by that time, the Aboriginal population was pretty much gotten rid of. But of course, genocide, and there was a film about a pilot that was shot down who had taken some pictures in Yugoslavia. I'm forgetting the name of it, but anyway, the Serbs and the Croatians, and of course Hitler's effort to wipe out the Jews. And in America, there were some Native American groups that were very hostile, and the U.S. just wiped them all out in military conflicts. Population transfer is another way of another form of conflict. Here, if you don't like the group, you push them far away to a remote area. To some extent, we could think of this as with the Mormon. Although the Mormons are not a racial group, they were, because of their practice historically of polygamy and other beliefs, they were pushed away. And of course, there was a large population in Utah. If you take away the land of the Native Americans and push them further away, or if you look at what's the country in Africa? There's a country in Africa where there's genocide going on right now, the Darfur region of Sudan, yes. What they'll do sometimes, instead of killing the people they don't like, they make them refugees and force them to leave and go elsewhere. So population transfer. Now, subjugation is the most common form of conflict. Here, the members are allowed to stay in the country, but they're kept in a lower status. And it could be by law, or it could be based in just cultural de facto subjugation. And so, and sometimes policies can be sneaky. Like historically, there were many universities that wouldn't accept Jewish applicants. And when the Supreme Court ruled that you have to, and then the Civil Rights Act prohibited that, as part of their admission criteria, they had to write an essay about how much they love Jesus. and if you didn't write a persuasive essay, they'd get rid of you. I mean, so what you did basically is a sneaky way of eliminating Jewish applicants, or the voting. Back when African Americans were allowed to the right to vote, one thing they do to prevent it is they'd have you take a civic literacy test. They'd ask you questions like, what is the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution? But the test was enforced unfairly. Like if you were white, they always passed you, even if you had no clue to the questions. But if you were black and had them all right, they'd say, well, that's not good enough.
Have you watched the movie Selma?
No.
In the beginning of the movie, she's trying to vote, and the guy's asking like, "Oh, what is the First, Second, Third Amendment?" And she word for word recites it, and then she asks him, "Well, do you know what it is?" And he's like, then he asks her, "Oh," then he asks him like more questions, and she doesn't know them, so he's not going to let her vote. And
Yeah. So the guy administering the test didn't know the answers, and she did, and they still wouldn't let her vote. So yeah, I mean that and today another practice that arguably continues is gerrymandering. Basically, what you do, congressional districts are supposed to be, solid, sort of square chunks. Like I say, you have a state that has whatever number of Congress people. What they would do is they would make a district that would look like the name comes from a salamander. They basically make a district that was majority white, so you had, say, a large concentration of African Americans where they should have a single voting district, but they'd carve it up into little chunks so that there was no place where they would get a majority. And of course, that's ruled to be unconstitutional. Now, prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice refers to preconceptions of a group, to having beliefs about a group that are often false and leads to discrimination. And of course, you don't want to go too far with this. I'll tell you a little story. Back when I taught at Calvin College, my best friend was Bob Butler. He was a reverend, an African-American guy, and also a sociologist. But I remember telling him once, I said, it's horrible, this stereotype that like black people like grits and stuff, and he said, we do, and we went to a restaurant, and I started eating grits then. It was really, really good. But the point is, there are things that are generally true. I mean, it's generally true that Korean people eat rice, and we'll talk more about stereotypes as we proceed, but prejudice does exist in your mind. And to some extent, all of us are prejudiced if we don't have much contact with the people. Like, I remember the first person that I interacted with a lot that was from Germany. Well, she was rude, and she was not a professor, but she was like a student guidance counselor at WSU. And I don't know, and not that I went around talking about it much, but I thought, is that how all Germans are? And of course it was not true. But initially, if you get that perception, it can become a prejudice. Now, discrimination, on the other hand, refers to unequal treatment. Now, there's valid and invalid discrimination. Valid means it's legitimate. So when I grade exams, in a sense, I'm discriminating. And the way I'm doing it is I'm looking for the right answers, and if they're wrong, then I take away points. But discrimination, though, is caused by prejudice, and it can be caused by other things like economic threats. But an example would be not hiring someone because you don't agree with or don't approve of their racial categorization, and so you can get, sometimes it's not meant to be intentional. Like, remember when I was in Guilderland, New York, and going to grad school, and I was at the Berean Baptist Church, and the pastor's wife came up to me and she said, "I want you to know that I approve of interracial relationships," and she emphasized "I," and I'm thinking, what does that mean? That everyone else thinks that everyone else in the church doesn't agree that I'm married to an Asian person? Remember, I had an African-American friend in Moses Lake, and he was married to a white lady, and he said a lot of times in restaurants when people just start chatting with strangers, they say, "How did you meet?" It's like anyone else. I mean, what the sort of the undercurrent is like, what in the heck is a white woman doing married to a black guy? I mean, they don't put it that way, but it comes across in that way. And so he said, I always have to explain, we met this way and fell in love. It's of course, prior to 1967, in many states, interracial relationships were criminalized. And there's a case we'll talk about that. I mean, you'd go to prison for it. Now, stereotypes, this is a set of ideas about a race or minority group that are based on distortion, exaggeration, or oversimplification. There can be positive and negative stereotypes. Like a positive stereotype would be assuming something good about you based on, like, well, you're Asian, so you must be good at math. Now, that's, of course, an insulting thing to say, just like telling a Canadian you must be good at hockey because you're French-Canadian or whatever. Negative stereotypes is assuming something negative, and like, what would be a negative stereotype about Hispanics? I'm not well to be racist, but I've heard people joke like they're only good for lawn mowing or something, some rude comment like that. A positive thing would be like, oh, they like to keep in touch with their extended family, etc. So, hate crimes, these are criminal acts motivated by prejudice, and there's some controversy here because you're doing the same thing, but you get a higher penalty if it's a hate crime. So we'll talk about, say, something simple, like say I stole your iPhone. I wouldn't do it, but say if I did that, and it came to the attention of the police that I stole it because you were a Jehovah's Witness and I don't like them, or you were whatever, you were gay, or you were Asian. So if the crime is motivated by the race or religion or sexual preference of the victim, you can have a sentence enhancement. Now, usually, though, it's hard to say because most people aren't going to tell the cops why they did it. And so, because a motive exists in your mind. Now, sometimes it's so obvious, like Matthew Shepard was beaten up in a cowboy bar in Wyoming because he was gay, and then he was tied to a fence post out in the farm area, and he either bled to death or froze to death. And just from the comments and the witnesses, it was clear that the reason they did it is because he was gay, and so that qualified as a hate crime. James Byrd was kidnapped by two white supremacists who had the tattoos and everything, and tied behind a pickup truck and dragged down a dirt road until he lost his limbs and, of course, was deceased. And funny thing is, his killers were, of course, executed. But I think this case is probably 20 years old, but it was the first time in Texas history that they have executed a white person for killing a black person. There tends to be that people who kill white people are more prone to get the death penalty. And ironically, that means whites are more prone to get it because murder tends to be uniracial. Well, why would you think that is? That most white people who get killed are killed by white people. And conversely, most black people who are murdered are murdered by black people.
Just believe in their own.
Yeah, I think it comes down to where people live. I mean, there are communities that are really diverse, but in a lot of cases, there are places in America that are primarily white or primarily black, and this is changing, but I think that kind of explains that result. Now, causes of discrimination. First is the psychological perspective. Well, actually, I want to go valid and invalid discrimination. Okay, valid discrimination would be something that had a legitimate, for example, to be a Navy SEAL, you have to be able to run and swim, and you have to pass all these physical tests, and this discriminates against people like me because I had a Guillain-Barré syndrome, and so my ankles are still very weak and my toes won't move, and plus I'm overweight, and so I don't think I'm going to pass the Navy SEAL test. But it's valid. Why is it valid discrimination to require? But incidentally, it also discriminates against women because women find it more difficult to pass the Navy SEAL test. Why is this test valid?
That's what they have to be able to do to get the job done.
Right, you have to be able to do that to get the job done. And so, on the other hand, here's in Washington State, back in the 60s, had a rule that to be a state trooper, you had to be 6'2". And there was a court case brought by, I think, some Puerto Rican person because they tend to be a little bit shorter. And the Washington State Supreme Court overturned that. They said that this is discriminatory, and there's no valid reason that you have to be 6'2" to do effective police work. And so the point is, some policies can have the impact or the effect of being racist, and sometimes it's covert. Like, let's say you're a high school and you want to hire a physical education teacher, PE. And so you say he has to have played collegiate hockey. Some high schools pull this. Now, why is it so that they don't want to hire a black person, but they can't out and out say that, so they say you have to have played collegiate hockey? How does that help them achieve their goal?
More people that play hockey are white.
Right, there aren't many, I'm not a hockey fan, but there aren't many black people who play college hockey. And so it's sort of a sneaky way of also internal hiring. Say you're an organization, you want to hire somebody, you put the ads up in the hallways. And by word of mouth, it gets around. And so you have an organization, if it's primarily white, if you hire internally, it's going to stay that way. Now, so the psychological perspective, it's thought that prejudice and discrimination are thought to be caused by deep-seated hostility and aggression that stem from frustration. So the Germans in the 1930s, there was economic problems, and the Treaty of Versailles sort of probably needed to be reworked. But they were in a situation where they were frustrated, and it was easier for them to become racist or to accept Hitler's goals and agenda. Just like I used to be a security guard in Darrington, Washington, at a lumber mill. It was a really large lumber mill. And there was a trend to shut down these mills, and for various political reasons. And the Japanese actually bought a lot of the logs, and had done some things like cutting down the trees without following a replanting plan. Ideally, you follow a plan. You harvest some trees and you plant some more, so it's a renewable resource. But they were just stripping it down, and so the Aryan Nation from Idaho was actually recruiting some of these guys who had been laid off from the lumber mill because they were frustrated and looking for someone to blame. So the idea here is that racism can be worse in that scenario. Now, functionalists would say discrimination is dysfunctional. It hasn't always existed, and at least not to an extreme degree. There might be some positive aspects to it. It can improve solidarity. And I mean, this is debatable, but when we have had wars, there's always this undercurrent of racism. Like when we fought the Japanese, we called them Japs, and when we fought the Koreans, we called them, I forgot the name. But the idea here that, does that promote national unity against the enemy is debatable. Conflict here, the majority would say, Marx would say that discrimination is used as a weapon of power to keep those who are discriminated in a lower position. And Marx said that what the rich will do is try to get various minority groups to hate each other. Like initially, the Irish Americans in America were considered a minority group, and they were pretty much forced to settle in frontier zones where they would be the speed bump should there be a hostile Native American incursion. So they were always the first to get into fights and so there was this hatred among the Irish and the Indians. And Marx said that basically that you're using this hate to keep people in their place. And so in a communist society, for Marx, race should not matter. Now, the symbolic interaction perspective talks a lot how it's possible through socialization to learn to be prejudiced. Language itself can be part of the problem, like the word black has negative connotations in some, like blacklist, things like that. Now, if the members of a minority are constantly treated as if they're less intelligent or crime-prone, they may act that way as a result, or lower expectations. Again, my friend Bob Butler, just because he liked to get in touch with youth, he did some substitute teaching in the local high schools while he was serving as a professor. And I remember he was told by some of the African American students who were playing the game with the mirror, they were reflecting the sun in his eyes and throwing things, and then he cracked down on that. He says, and then several of the black people said, well, you're treating us like we're white, like what's up with this? And he was very upset. He says, what, you mean like teachers around here let you do this just because you're black? And they said, yeah, and he actually made some complaints about that, because the idea here is if you expect less of people, they may act that way. Now, socialization, how is it that someone can be socialized to accept racist ideas? There's a really good film. It's kind of violent, but it has anyone seen that? It's nominated for an Academy Award. Have you seen that? It's called American History X. But yeah. So this shows how a guy, over time, through his father and associates, learned to become racist.
It's hard to look back and see the truth about people you love. I think if you asked Derek why it all went the way it did and where it all started, he'd still say it started when our father was murdered. The truth is, it started earlier.
All right. We'll all be together for the game tonight.
Yes, definitely.
All right, Ben's Burger, 7 o'clock, and we'll go watch the big guy play.
Yeah.
Second up the game?
Oh, yeah, I'm always good at that. I got
Matter of grade, you're gonna get a B. Wait, you did good. B minus. Don't laugh.
This guy is different, Dr. Sweeney. This guy's unbelievable. Unbelievable. I've never had a teacher like this. He's got like 2 PhDs. I don't know what he's doing teaching at our school. He's not like other teachers.
What's he got you reading?
We got this essay exam on this book, Native Son. All in this book.
Native Son, what's that? I don't know that.
It's a big surprise.
Why don't you read?
I mean, they don't teach Tom Clancy in school. Well, they don't.
So what is his Native Son? What is
I mean, it's like this book that's a black guy, you know? We're doing this whole black literature in it.
What is it, Black History Month?
No, it's just like this guy Sweeney, you know? Part of the course now.
Yeah.
What?
Nothing, it's just, you know, it's everywhere you look now.
What?
This affirmative action.
Honey, a few new books doesn't qualify as affirmative black action.
Hey, read the book, ace the guy's test, just don't swallow everything you feed your wall, you know, just because you see it on the evening news. I know, but like what? All this stuff about making everything equal, it's not that simple. Look, now you get this book, Native Son. You know, what happened to the other books in the course? They're not any good anymore because Mr. 2 PhD says they are? Huh? But you gotta trade in great books for black books? Does that make sense? Huh? You gotta question these things there. You gotta look at the whole picture. You know, we're talking about books here, but I'm also talking about my job. I got 2 black guys on my squad now who got their job over a couple of white guys who actually scored higher in the test. Does that make sense? Huh? Yeah, sure, everything's equal now. But I got 2 guys watching my back, responsible for my life, who aren't as good as 2 other guys. You only got the job because they were black, not because they were the best. That sucks. Yeah. Is that what America's about? No, America's about the best man for the job. You do your best, you get your job. You know, this affirmative action crap. I don't know what that's about. There's like some hidden agenda or something going on. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. No, I didn't think about it like that. Wow. This guy, though, I don't know, Dr. Sweeney comes on like so strong. It's kind of hard not to listen to it, but I don't know, maybe some of what he says is kind of
bullshit.
Yeah.
Maybe. No. It's nigger bullshit. You see that, don't you?
Yeah.
You gotta watch out for that.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying, I will.
Good boy. Right.
Anyway, so it kind of shows how it's possible through growing up and being raised to acquire racist attitudes and beliefs. Now, institutional discrimination, this is the discrimination that occurs within an organization, business, or some government agency. It can be direct, that's intentional, so making laws or policies to subjugate a minority. That's less common because it's illegal now, since the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But we have indirect institutional discrimination. Here, the laws or policies are not, at least on the surface, intended to discriminate, but they have that impact. The example of internal hiring. If you're an organization and you're all white and you put advertisements for new positions in the hallways, you're going to probably stay white. So anyway, we're going to talk about we're a little bit behind time, so I'm going to skim through some of this, but we're going to talk about some of the major minority groups in America now. African Americans is a large group, and they've gained political power. But the poverty rate is very high. And in fact, it's been said that statistically, an African American man has a higher chance of going to jail than graduating with a university degree. And so that's unfortunate. Political gains have been made, though, and there's moving up. Of course, as your textbook says, there's sort of the two black Americas. I'll give you an example of this. When my brother-in-law came to America to visit us, it was in Chicago at the time, and he liked jazz, and he wanted to go to a jazz club, African American jazz club, and I Googled it, and we went to one, and this is all a bunch of rich African American guys. I mean, the jazz was good, but it was just everyone in there were lawyers and doctors, and so there's this sort of a dichotomy, as your textbook talks about. So the two black Americas. Now, Latinos, it's a very large group, and it will be the biggest minority group over time due to immigration and higher rates of birth. It's a very diverse group. In fact, the only thing that, when we talk about Latinos, the only thing that they have in common completely is speaking Spanish. I mean, so Cubans, Mexicans, etc., they're very different. And politically, they're gaining power as well. Of course, it'll be interesting to see this. When Trump was talking about this build, I want a tall wall, I thought this is just, there's no way, but it seems as if we're heading in that direction. I mean, do you think we're going to see a 40-foot wall built up? Or is that just, the cost is crazy. And, the ironic thing is most people who come into the country and overstay their visa or who are labeled illegal, they come through the border crossings. And then they just stay and work. So I'm not sure that it exactly will fix that problem. But anyway, that's an aside. Now, Native Americans, this is a group of about 2 million. Many are small or large tribes. They're tending, though, to leave the reservation and assimilate into the regular society. Poverty rates are high among, and oftentimes they're exploited because they can have casinos, but a lot of times they're run by white people from the outside, hired, and they don't. The money isn't put back into the reservation. Tax-free tobacco, and in some states like Maryland and Washington, they've pumped up the tax on what they call sin tax. So on cigarette, they made I think in one state the pack of cigarettes is like $13 and some change, and so there's a high. Being able to buy it from a reservation is a lot cheaper. Now, Asian Americans, there are about 11 million in America, and they've proved to be very successful. The Japanese Americans, for example, were put into internment camps. And by the way, we didn't do this to the other, World War II, we were fighting against the Italians, the Germans, and the Japanese, primarily. There were a few smaller countries. But we put what we did is we put the Japanese in internment camps even if there was no evidence that they weren't patriotic. And over time, though, we allowed them to get out of the internment camps and volunteer to fight the Germans or the Italians, and they were in an all Japanese unit. And they had very high casualty rates because they were intentionally put into bad situations, like trying to break through the German lines in the Battle of the Bulge to save a Texas regiment that was entrapped. And so they did. They broke through and saved them, but had huge casualty rates. And all the while, their family were incarcerated in the States. And by the way, they lost their material belongings too, their homes and so forth. There's a movie called I'm forgetting the name of it. But anyway, a little interesting fact was, there was a woman, she was white, married to a Japanese guy, and they were going to say, if you divorce your husband, then we won't put you in the internment camp. And she didn't want to. Her husband was overseas fighting the Germans, and so she had to, she burned all her dolls, because once you get to the internment camp, they only let you have 2 suitcases, and she had a huge doll collection, and it would have went to somebody else, so she just burned them all and went to the internment camp. But I don't know, that'd be a hard situation. If given the choice of divorcing your husband or going to the internment camp, what would you do? Go to the camp? Yeah. And so, I mean, the same thing with the prior to I didn't talk so much about that case where what's the name? But it went to the Supreme Court where it was a white guy married to an African American lady, and they did it legally in Maryland, but when they went to a southern state where it was criminalized, then they got arrested, and they were going to be put in prison for having an interracial marriage. Now, white ethnics, unless it's a large city, they've mainly assimilated and don't hold their unique culture anymore. There are some white ethnic enclaves that are Dutch or Swedish, but it's becoming less and less common today. Jewish Americans, like Asians, there was early discriminations, but now Jews are mostly successful, and there isn't that level of discrimination. And something of an aside, there's a sociologist named Jennifer Richardson, no relationship to me, by the way, but she did a study that found that racism lowers your ability to solve problems and your IQ. That is, if given a task that's not, for example, connect this speaker to the computer and get it working. If you didn't know how to do it, I guess you Google it. But she gave, in her experiment, she gave people tasks that required a modest amount of knowledge and motivation. And she found people who were racist tended to have this black and white mentality, so that it was slower and it was harder for them to be creative and solve problems. She actually, in a survey, asked them what they thought about the Darwinians. There is no group, but the people who were racist thought the Darwinians were probably prone to welfare dependency and didn't smell very good or something like that. So it was funny because you throw in a group that doesn't even exist, and people who are racist will be sure that group is not at all acceptable. So we're going to go ahead and stop there, and I'm going to review for the quiz. All right, so you need to know that a minority group is a group that's discriminated against. They don't have to be a numerical minority. So women are a minority. We said that sociologists don't agree with this racial classification thing, the idea that everybody perfectly fits into one box. Now, we talked about valid and invalid discrimination, and I said that, like in the Navy SEAL training, it's valid discrimination because they have to do these, or they might possibly have to do these things, like they have to swim and run and so forth. So that's valid. It is discrimination, but it's valid. Okay, hate crime, we say hate crime is where it's done based on the race or religion or sexual preference of the victim. So I wouldn't do this, but say I threw a plate of spaghetti at my wife because I didn't like the way that it tasted. That's not a hate crime because it's not based on her race or religion at all. It's just common domestic violence. So not all crimes are a hate crime. It has to be dependent on the motive. Okay, we said in World War II, it was just the Japanese who got put into the internment camps. Germans and Italians were not put into those camps. So, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and pass out the quiz, but let me make sure I'll just stop this here.